Greetings! Oh my goodness, it's so wonderful to see everyone. I hope you all don't mind that I took my mask off just for this brief speaking occasion. I want to welcome you to this wonderful event today. It's actually wonderful to actually be in person again for the first time in a long time. And Karen, if I'm right, this is our first in-person event since March of 2020, and I cannot be more grateful that you are our first guests, and the topic is on housing. So for those of you who don't know who I am Amy Liu. I'm a vice president at Brookings, and I lead Brookings Metro. And on behalf of our entire team at Brookings, we are so excited to celebrate the release of Jenny Schuetz's new book, Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing System. I know I am talking to friends in the community here, but you all know that this book comes at a perfect time. And one is because there's just greater awareness across the country, leaders nationally and in local communities around the country, that it is time to address the structural challenges that have long existed in our country: rising inequality, greater segregation, economic insecurity, and environmentally unsustainable development patterns. And these challenges are acute in every part of the United States. From the high-tech, hot markets on the West Coast to the growing places along the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic, to the mid-sized, older industrial cities in the middle of the country that have long suffered from redlining and disinvestment. And in all of these contexts, I think you know, there's one common thread, which is the role of housing and land use in contributing to those long-standing patterns. And therefore, housing and land use being critical to the solutions today. And that is exactly why this book is so important, is that Jenny's book does an amazing job of, in very plain language, reminding us what the problem is and very clearly explaining what we can do together. And that is also why I want to add that Jenny comes at a perfect time in our country, and her voice and her leadership is just absolutely refreshing. I want to say that I think if all of you who follow her work know, she has so effortlessly made housing policy and housing markets plain and so easy to understand. She has expanded the idea of solutions beyond subsidies, and I can say that because I started my time at HUD, but she's expanded it beyond subsidies to a larger set of tools. And zoning reforms, being one of those tools, has often been a third rail. And I swear, under Jenny's leadership and her passion and her expertise, she has honestly made it safe for many local leaders to attack zoning reforms head on, from Boston to even here in the district, to promote zoning changes, even promote gentle density, increase the supply of housing in the right locations, aka ending exclusionary zoning practices. And then finally, I think you all know, she has made the housing topic fun. And you can see it in her tweets. You can see in the way I think she wrote about the Minneapolis housing reforms to a holiday jingle. And you can see it in the title of this book. So it is, for me, a real pleasure to have Jenny at Brookings, and for us to give her the space to bring her talents to this important work, joining all of you who are also really dedicated to making changes in the housing and land use policy area. Before I bring Jenny and Jerusalem up here on the stage to have this conversation about the book, I do want to just name a few housekeeping notes. If you haven't already purchased your book, you'll see that we're not selling the book today, but you can purchase it online. I would normally say Amazon, but I would prefer you go to a locals bookstore, or there's a one, Politics and Prose downstairs. You can do that. You also see that there are index cards on your seats. Today's Q&A is going to be principally done through the cards. So if you have any questions that come to mind during the discussion, is to write the questions down on the note card and hand it to Karen, who's going to be on the side. She's got pens. I've got a pen if you didn't bring one today. And that's how we're going to moderate the discussion. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers for this evening. So I'm going to ask Jerusalem and Jenny to come up. I think many of you know that Jerusalem Demsas is a reporter with Vox, though I think she's soon going to be starting a new role at The Atlantic, so congratulations. Her insightful coverage, I think you all are familiar with, on economics and the politics of housing has really significantly raised the profile of this important topic. And Jenny, as you all well know, is a great friend, colleague, and a senior fellow at Brookings Metro. So I'm going to hand things over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction. We have one microphone, so it's going to be a fun little game of handoff. But me and Jenny were actually texting earlier today about an infuriating decision that has just come out of California. So I think we're just going to start there. So for those of you who are not aware, the California Supreme Court today ruled that UC Berkeley has to rescind the acceptances of over 3,000 students they have already accepted, some of whom were going to go to the institution, some of them who are not, and in response to a lawsuit from, I think I can call them NIMBYs, at the local level in Berkeley, who are upset for a myriad of reasons. But what's interesting about this, and what's going to, I think, dominate our conversation today, is not just that they had, reservations about students having parties in their neighborhoods, or the fact that they did not like that UC Berkeley was so dominant in their community, but that they were allowed through the law to impose those preferences upon the housing stock and to treat students as pollutants, essentially. So, Jenny, I think this is a really good lens for a way to kind of look at a lot of the issues in your book. So, how do you untangle this through the lens of fixer-upper?
Yeah, I mean, everything that's wrong with our housing and land use system is in this case, right? So it sort of captures, we've constructed a system where people who already are in the community essentially become gatekeepers and can decide who gets to move into the community after them. So there are some long-term homeowners in Berkeley, people who've been there for 30 years, who bought homes when it was a much, much more accessible and affordable place. They got there, they like their neighborhood the way it is, and they don't want other people to move in, they don't want apartment buildings, they don't want students, and everybody gets their lifestyle preference, but the idea that because you've been in a community for 10 years already, you get to impose your lifestyle preferences on everybody else. And it's particularly nuts that this is the flagship university of California. This is people's chance to get an education. Berkeley and many of the UC schools are really the way that kids from non-wealthy families enter into a profession, a career, get started in life, that there are kids who are not going to get the chance to go to their first choice college because a bunch of people who went to Berkeley 30 years ago say, I don't want an apartment building in my neighborhood, is crazy, right? And the university, which is a state institution, the city of Berkeley wants to build student housing to accommodate this. The governor wants this to go forward. So there are a handful of homeowners and the California Supreme Court who can shut down all of these broad public benefits for the whole state, right? And if that's not a perfect metaphor for all the things we've done wrong, I don't know what is.
Yeah, so we're very angry, but we're going to take a step back, I think, and think also kind of broadly here, and define the problem for folks. So there are a bunch of different measures, but the one I like to use is the one that comes out of Freddie Mac, that we're at a 3.8 million unit housing shortage right now. Obviously, it's at the top of mind for everyone as housing prices have gotten higher than ever before. Rents are now skyrocketing as well, even though there were some differences happening during the last couple of years due to COVID, but rents are skyrocketing as well. And there are, I think one of the things I find really interesting about how you kind of separate out the problem in this book is that you separate the problem of poverty from the problem of housing. Can you talk a little about those two differences and why we should address those separately?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that I wanted to accomplish in the book, is to acknowledge that we don't have one housing problem. We have multiple housing problems. Some of these differ by place. Some of them differ by sort of age and tenure of the households, renters versus owners. But one of the really stark things is that poor households everywhere in the U.S., the poorest 20% of households, can't afford market rate housing. They can't afford to rent an apartment. And that's true not just in places like D.C. and New York and San Francisco. That's also true in smaller rural areas, right? In parts of West Texas, in cities like Cleveland and Baltimore, where housing is objectively pretty cheap, but the people who live there also have very low incomes, right? So 20% of households in every metro area in the country and in rural areas can't afford market rate housing, right? That's a low income problem, and the easiest way to solve that is give people more money so that they can afford decent quality housing, right? So partly because we know this is a national issue, then we have the more geographically focused issue, which is in DC and New York and California, that we have this particularly bad shortage of homes, right? So for 30 years or more, California and Boston and New York haven't built enough homes to keep up with the growth of population and jobs and income, right? And those aren't caused necessarily by the same thing. It's particularly bad to be poor in a place where housing is really expensive, but it's bad to be poor everywhere, right? I think it's helpful on the solution side to focus on, for people who just don't have enough income, we can give them money, right? If Congress wanted to open its checkbook, we could give people child tax credit, earned income tax credit, housing vouchers, cash, universal basic income. We've got lots of ways to give poor people money if we chose to do that. The harder problem to solve in some sense is the shortage of housing, because that's controlled by 40,000 local governments, and every local government has an incentive not to build enough housing, especially for lower income households.
And that incentive, I think, is interesting to kind of detangle a bit, because it's not just like a simple story where it's in the interests of these local governments to restrict the housing. We've seen polling, for instance, about how a lot of people do want more housing generally be built in these areas. But I think one thing that you do really well is that you talk about how local homeowners have sort of captured local government in a way, and how often I'll talk to local officials and they are unaware of the fact that it is quite popular to actually support pro-housing policies. So can you talk to us a little bit about not just the research behind, both the research behind how it is that homeowners have captured local government, and also, what can be done about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because we pose this in some ways as an outcome of democratic choice. So local governments control the levers over housing production. They decide where housing can be built. They control the approval process. They set out the steps that developers have to go through in order to build, what kinds of housing can be built. But one of the really important things is that they have made this a participatory process. So a developer wants to build a new apartment building on an empty parking lot. They have to hold public meetings. That means that the people who already live in the community get to come out and voice their opinion. But it turns out that not everybody in the community is equally likely to come out and voice their opinion. The people who show up at these community meetings tend to be older. They're more likely to be homeowners. They're more likely to be high income, wealthy. They're also more likely to be white and male. And in many cases, they're retired people who have time on their hands. They don't want their neighborhoods to change, some of which is understandable, right? Most of us like our neighborhood, are comfortable. We don't necessarily want things to be different, but that we have given the existing residents veto power over development, and we have given a special preference to these long-standing homeowners over people who don't yet live in the community, right? So many of the people who would benefit from new housing don't live in these exclusive places because they can't afford to live there yet, right? So we have taken away essentially the right of people, the voice of people who aren't yet in the community, and given preference to people who've been there for a long time. But one of the interesting things is, I don't know if we can say that there's a silent majority in favor of more housing. We don't know, because we don't actually do polling on this. But there are a lot of people who would be willing to have more housing, who would like for their community to grow and be more vibrant, would like for their kids to be able to move back to the community and buy a house. they don't show up and make noise. And so the elected officials hear the NIMBYs saying no, no, no. They don't hear the yeses, right? So one of the ways we're going to have to try to change this is get people who support housing to show up at community meetings. Send an email or a phone call to your city council member or your county supervisor and say, I'd like you to build more housing. I'd like us to grow. I'd like us to be a more vibrant and inviting place.
Yeah, and I'd love to sort of just tease that out a bit, because I think there's a tension, right, that we have to get Jenny's best angles. So everyone, they're all great. I think we tease out a little bit of a problem here, right? Because on one hand, and you talk about this really well in your book, kind of you see the growth of participatory democracy in this space happen in a response to the urban renewal, the blazing through especially Black neighborhoods with highways and things like this, and seeing a very big lack of interest in whether people on the ground are happy or unhappy with the changes. And so the response to that ends up being, local voice becomes much more important to the process of development. One way the Yes in My Backyard movement has kind of said, okay, this is the process. We're going to have a bunch of people show up. We're going to have a bunch of people come to these meetings and say there is a pro-housing voice in this. But one thing that I think has become much more dominant recently is just a rejection entirely of that as a process by which we should be even evaluating development decisions. It doesn't really make sense that I have any voice at all in whether a 3-story or 4-story building comes up on my block. The point of representative democracy is that I elect someone to think about that for me, and I can do these book talks instead. I think that's a tension there. And I guess, do you think the pro-housing movement needs to pick a side, or in that kind of a battle, or is this something where both of these need to be pursued, given that the existing framework is that you have to use these meetings to get anything done?
So I think it's hard to imagine putting the community process back in the bottle, right? That genie is out, and once people get used to the idea that there is a venue for them to express their opinion, I think trying to take that away, right? Trying to just allow everything by right, that you can go down to City Hall and pay for your permit and go build an apartment building without having some sort of public process, I think would be very hard to do. I think there are a couple of things we could do to make it a more balanced process. So limiting the amount of community input, right? You don't necessarily need to have 20 meetings over 5 years to get approval, right? You can have one meeting and people can show up and they can yell and then they go home and that's it, right? But this doesn't need to drag on forever. I think doing other things like polling to get a broader cross-section of the community would help. But one of the other ways that we can think about sort of structurally changing the rules of the game is maybe not all of the decisions get made by the local government, or maybe there's a backstop, say the state government. States are easier to imagine doing this than the federal government. So, the state of California could say, for instance, here's a list of projects that have broad community benefit, like student housing and dorms, or protected bike lanes and high-frequency bus lanes. So things that have environmental benefit, that have social benefit. If it has 20% of the units restricted for low-income households, this is a broad public benefit. They could have a set of things that go through an expedited process where it's harder for the community to block, right? Instead of the onus being on the developer to prove that this isn't going to create traffic congestion, the onus should be on the existing homeowners to prove that the amount of the detriment is going to be, outweigh the broader public benefits. So we could change the calculus a little bit, allow states in particular to push forward on projects that have clear community benefit, and essentially balance things out a little bit so that localities can't kill the economy for the region and the state.
Yeah, and one of the groups who did really great research on community meetings, Catherine Einstein and her co-authors, they actually looked during the pandemic when things turned to Zoom meetings to see if you make it more accessible, can you get a more representative sample of the population? They find that no, it's actually slightly less representative of the population, which indicated to me that there's just a set of people who are weird enough to show up to community meetings, and there's just some people are not going to do that, no matter how easy you make it. And I think that's kind of an indictment of the entire process, but it's a great point that probably genie's out of the bottle right now. And then this kind of also brings me back to the CEQA example of, when I want to talk a little bit about the environmental impact here, because one of the ways in which that people block housing is through not just CEQA, but at the national level, NEPA. Can you talk a little bit about how it is that supposedly environmentalist movement has kind of been hijacked in certain places with kind of homeowners' desire to build less housing and kind of the negative environmental impacts of that?
Yeah, it's actually fascinating how people perceive projects to be either climate friendly or not climate friendly. So I have this conversation often with people who live in neighborhoods like Northwest DC, right? So in areas like Friendship Heights or Cleveland Park, and they will say, well, my neighborhood is very green, it's very leafy, we have yards, we have lots of these old trees. If you build an apartment building and you have to cut down trees to build the apartment building, then that's clearly not green. So we shouldn't be building apartments in Cleveland Park, right? That would be terrible. I said, well, if we don't build apartment buildings in Cleveland Park, where do you think people are going to live who are moving to DC for jobs and need a place to live? And I've looked at the patterns in DC, and the answer is we're building something like 70 to 80% of our new housing in Frederick, Maryland, in Loudoun, in Prince William, in Spotsylvania. So the really far out exurban counties, which, by the way, are not on the metro system, right? Which are built in bigger houses in places that are entirely car dependent. So you got to get in your car to drive to the grocery store, to drive your kids to drop them off at school. You can't walk to anything, right? You can't take public transportation. These are bigger homes. So instead of building an apartment building in Cleveland Park where people can ride the metro that would actually be greener for the region, we're building all of our housing in these very ungreen places. But the Cleveland Park homeowners don't know that, right? And they don't go to Loudoun, and they don't go to Frederick, and they don't see the new housing there, so they don't even realize how bad this is for the region, right? Which again goes back to state governments or potentially the federal government have an incentive to encourage more development in truly climate-friendly places. And that would be one way that they could get into this, to say, look, we need to be building more of our housing contiguous to transit in places where people can walk, and local governments just can't refuse to do that.
And we're in DC, and I'm sure a lot of people here work for the federal government, so we've talked a little bit about state and local governments and their responsibilities. But one of the things that's interesting about this entire space is that a lot of the people who are the most vocal are very concentrated, and the potential beneficiaries are extremely diffuse, and they're all over the country. If someone can't move from Idaho to New York City, that's not something that's ever noticed by a political system, because whose constituency is that? The federal government has started, it seems, in recent years to start considering this more. In terms of the number of blog posts I see from the CEA, I guess that's the metric I'm using to figure out if they're paying attention to it more. It seems like there are pretty severe limits on what they're willing to do. In my opinion, it seems mostly politically, what they believe is politically feasible. But from your perspective, kind of putting aside the politics for a bit, could the federal government really seriously engage on this issue? Whether it's from HUD's perspective, and I know you've written a bit about what they could do with existing grants, or if it's from Congress, like what could be done here from the federal angle?
Yeah, there are some levers the federal government could push. Federal government doesn't have direct authority over land use, right? So it's harder to do what state governments could, which is just essentially like take back some of the zoning power. The federal government's big power is the power of the purse, right? So they provide a lot of money to local governments already, to state governments. HUD doesn't provide as much money to the places that most need to be spanked, right? So HUD doesn't give a ton of money to the really wealthy suburbs that have the most exclusionary zoning. San Francisco could do a lot better. Northwest DC could do a lot better. So HUD could, in theory, be more strategic about some of their money, although even that, they would probably need Congress to rewrite some of the formulas, right? They don't have a lot of discretionary money that they could just change right now. I think the real potential power of the purse is probably probably through something like Department of Transportation, which gives a lot of money to more places, right? So there are more communities that get funding, and the DOT money goes through these regional metropolitan planning authorities, which are kind of the right geographic scale to think about land use, right? So there's already a pot of money for transportation that says you should come up with a plan for regional transportation that works, for public transportation and for road maintenance. If the regional planning organizations also had pots of money for housing, they could also incentivize better housing plans, right? So I would love to see things like the Community Development Block Grant Program and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit given to a regional MPO, which has the ability to say, for anybody in the region to get this money, we've got to come up with a plan to do this in the right way, right? We've got to be building housing where we need it. We've got to coordinate the housing funding and the transportation funding. You know, we've been spending money building things like light rail lines in neighborhoods where you can only build a single-family detached home in walking distance of the light rail. You know, that's a phenomenal waste of our federal transportation money, but the transportation people and the housing people don't talk to one another, right? Coordinating those funding streams would help a lot. I mean, Congress is going to have to do all of this, so like, I'm not super optimistic we're going to get there quickly, but we might as well put some options on the table.
And one of the things that I think I've noticed, especially over the last year, is as you have a growing recognition of the housing affordability problem, but the federal government in particular feels sort of that its hands are tied, whether or not that's true, feels its hands are tied to actually do anything, you get kind of, you know, potentially counterproductive policies kind of being promoted. You know, one of the things that, you know, I've written about and I've talked to you a lot about, Jenny, is what do you do when the housing supply is fixed? Congress wants to give money and, you know, fix it through demand-side policies, whether it's increasing vouchers or homeownership subsidies because they're worried about first-time homebuyers not being able to ever actually become first-time homebuyers, or the racial homeownership gap, and, you know, want to provide benefits to people who have historically not been able to buy a home. But when that is paired with, you know, low supply and a relatively fixed supply in certain areas where these people tend to be, you know, it just raises prices, or it raises prices for a lot of people. So, you know, how do you deal with that problem? And I think you talk a lot about how interconnected these issues are in your book.
Yeah, it's impossible to think about the supply side and the subsidy side not interacting, right? So, you know, if we suddenly made housing vouchers an entitlement and every poor household in California, for instance, got a voucher, it's probably true that a lot of people wouldn't be able to use it, either because landlords wouldn't accept it, there aren't enough apartments to go around. And if you suddenly had a bunch more people who had more money to spend on apartments, but you didn't have more apartments, landlords would just keep raising the rent and people wouldn't necessarily be better off, right? So I think we've accepted at this point that you have to expand supply and expand subsidy together. These really have to be planned and coordinated. You know, the hard part is, even if we changed all of the zoning rules overnight, California is going to take 30 years to dig themselves out of a hole. The country overall is going to take, you know, needs a decade of really intensive building to catch up. So expanding subsidies while supply takes years to catch up, we're likely to run into some problems, right? But I don't think the lack of enough supply is not a reason not to give poor people money, right? I mean, the answer is not just, we're not going to give poor people money and we're going to expect you to wait for supply to catch up. Like, we need to provide people with more cash today. But I think we're going to have to think more creatively about other things we can do on the, particularly the subsidized housing side. You know, buy existing older apartment buildings that might either be falling out of condition for use or are getting bought and, you know, the rent is increased. You know, bring those into the affordable stock quickly so that people have a place to live while the market rate side tries to catch up with things. I mean, I feel like we should, those of us who talk about solutions, should be as honest as possible about what's going to happen and how quickly. If we promise people, you know, if you implemented all of the recommendations in my book tomorrow, would that solve the crisis overnight? No, right? So we need to kind of keep expectations reasonable. Some of these things are going to take a while to take effect. On the other hand, not starting down the road of better policies is not going to make things better. It's only going to make things worse. And so at some point, we're going to have to start taking at least baby steps in the right direction.
And we're sitting in the Wharf right now, which is a very new sort of development that's happened. I've grown up in the Montgomery County, Maryland, and now DC area my entire life. So I've seen how different DC has gotten, and I've seen how not different parts of DC have gone. And there is this really interesting tension where, people who are very aware of the housing supply crisis are sort of loath to ever criticize any new housing development, including myself, because, you're just one more voice stopping housing from existing. And you talk a little bit about how you kind of have to balance displacement risk when you only are putting new housing development in poor regions and not in wealthier places. I mean, if anyone has, I was just talking about this with some folks earlier, but if you have ever gone up 16th Street 10 years ago, it looks exact same as it looked right now today. So in Northwest DC, and this is obviously a predominantly older, wealthier, whiter area. And so, while there's a ton of research showing that even if you increase housing in low-income areas, that actually helps displacement, that doesn't work indefinitely if you don't increase enough, because you can't build infinitely in these places. You have to build in large swaths of the community that have not seen housing for a long time. So how do you balance this desire to make sure you're not just putting the burden in certain areas, but also not to treat housing like it's a burden when it's actually the solution?
Yeah, I mean, these are really difficult political conversations, and I find it helpful to talk in concrete terms as much as possible, right? So DC is a great example. I mean, I love the Wharf and Navy Yards and NOMA, in part because it's a ton of new housing in neighborhoods that didn't have that much housing before, right? So in a literal sense, there wasn't that much displacement because we were displacing parking lots with new apartments, right? That is the ideal situation. And we've done a lot of that, right? The new housing in DC has been very concentrated in places that were not residential, but we're gonna run out of those pretty soon. I think by the time we finish Walter Reed, I don't know if we've got big parcels left. And then the only way that you start getting more new housing, at some point you have to look at the low density neighborhoods, right? I love the idea of doing an upzoning citywide rather than neighborhood by neighborhood, because I think it's politically really hard just to upzone the rich white neighborhoods, which is kind of what I would like to do. But it's easier to make the case we should rezone the whole city. And developers could go anywhere, but they're gonna go to the rich neighborhoods because that's where land is most valuable, and they'd like to do this. So I think some of these, like rallying people around a citywide policy change rather than what we have done, which is neighborhood by neighborhood, and it always winds up, the neighborhoods that wind up getting more new housing are the ones that either don't have that many residents or their residents are not organized enough to fight back, right? And that always puts the onus on neighborhoods that don't have as much political capital. And at some point, we shouldn't put the onus on them, right? We shouldn't make it their problem to fight back. We should just make it an assumption that every neighborhood is going to grow by some amount.
And we're going to start taking questions from the audience in just about 10, 15 minutes. So if you do have questions, put them on your note card and hand them to Karen back there. She's waving for everyone, so if you haven't, she also has pens for you. So, but I want to turn my attention back to making fun of California because I'm an East Coast girl, so that's my job. But one thing you talk about in your book a lot is and we tried to touch on this a little bit, is the environmental impact of kind of the sprawl that gets induced when you don't build in these dense, labor markets that are actually where everyone wants to live. And you talk also about kind of the insurance markets and what's happening there. And we've seen with these fires in California, we've seen with flooding in different parts of the country and hurricane risks, people continue to rebuild in the same places where there are these risks. And you even see governments instituting policies where it is illegal for insurance to remove its coverage of places that they believe are now uninsurable because the risk is too high. And of course, this climate change is making that much, much worse, and it's going to continue for the foreseeable future. So, what do you do with that? Can you first define the problem for us a little bit here? Why is this happening? And then also, what can be done?
Yeah, this is a sort of our super complicated housing finance system, as it turns out, is setting up all of the wrong incentives. So when people buy a house in some place like South Florida, where sea level rise, even without hurricanes, is going to become a problem, the homeowner doesn't bear the full cost of climate change coming and destroying the house. California, again, places that burn down year after year after year, the insurance company pays for some of this. this. Our federal disaster recovery programs pays for some of this. And so no one entity has all of the financial risk. And so nobody has the incentive not to continue doing this stuff. There are a couple of big levers we can push. On the housing finance side, more than 2/3 of mortgages are guaranteed by Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, which are still under regulation by the federal government. We could choose either not to give mortgages in places that are really high risk or to make the mortgages more expensive. So you want to buy a house on the coast of South Florida, your interest rate is going to be twice as high as somebody who's buying in a place that's not going to flood, right? So going forward, that would be a good way to ease into it. It's really hard to imagine yanking insurance or yanking mortgage coverage from the places that already exist, right? So we've got a lot of real estate that's at high risk, but if we take away all of the coverage now, we're penalizing people who bought there, and we run into equity problems, right? So in places like Houston, New Orleans, people who live in flood-prone areas tend to be low income and black and brown. They bought in those places because that's where they could afford to buy, right? So taking away their insurance or raising their mortgage interest rates because they were discriminated against buying in safer places would be really unfair, right? So we're going to have this sort of delicate balance of changing the rules going forward. We have to be honest about the fact that a bunch of people live in places that they shouldn't live, and we need to move them, right? This is going to be a really hard conversation, but there are a lot of people who can't continue to live in their communities. There are whole neighborhoods and cities that need to be relocated. The federal government has some money to do that, but nowhere near enough for the scale of the problem. And we've sort of been sticking our heads in the sand and hoping it will go away. And newsflash, it won't. It's going to get worse. And trying to solve it in a short period of time when climate change is even worse is going to be much, much harder politically.
And it actually seems like we're sort of doing the opposite right now, because we're trying to, I think with good intention, increase the homeownership rate for first-time home buyers, people who are from disadvantaged communities, and the places where there is affordable housing tend to be these places where there is also high climate risk. I mean, there was a recent NPR investigation that showed that HUD was disproportionately sending mortgage or helping folks buy homes in places with high flood risk. And it's a situation where, of course, that's not the intention, but that's what happens when you're, the low-income housing is now being made available in these distressed areas. And I also want to talk a little bit more about, how it is that we actually deal with the political problem of Nimbyism, because at the very core, it feels like there is a very human element to being NIMBY. Like, it is something where, people have preferences for stability. You have aesthetic preferences here. But it does feel like there's something, I'm not sure if you think it's even worth trying to address as like a political problem of just trying to convince people, or if all of the attention needs to be what California, what Washington State, what Oregon and Connecticut have tried to do, which is just say, okay, there are going to be people who are angry. We need to move the levers of power out of their reach and move it to the state government. So we're going to legalize duplexes statewide, or we're going to legalize ADUs statewide. Is it worth trying to address this problem at all, or is this kind of just like a human sentiment that exists everywhere? Because as we've seen, the housing crisis is not limited to the United States. It doesn't seem like NIMBYism is an American phenomenon at all.
It's not, and it's actually fascinating when I talk to groups in other countries. I'm focused very much on the policies and institutions in the US that are problematic, but then I talk to people in the UK, in Canada, in France. They have different policies and institutions, but they have kind of the same problem. So some of this really is the human element of NIMBYism, as you point out, that just a lot of people don't want to accept change of any kind in their neighborhood. I think we're going to have to press on all of the political levers. So I do think that state involvement is a really promising way to go, because states are realizing that this hurts their economy, this hurts their climate, this isn't good for economic mobility. State governments have a bunch of tools, and they're starting to organize. So that's one of my future areas of research, is thinking more concretely about what states can do and how do they do that, and how do we build the political support at the state level. I do think the federal government leaning on its levers, particularly funding for things like transportation, has to be part of the solution. Part of the reason why I wrote this book is to engage people who aren't NIMBYs, but they're not YIMBYs. Right, so they maybe haven't paid that much attention, right? If you bought a home, you don't notice rents going up as quickly, so you may not notice that this is a problem. The climate implications of housing are so complicated, right? You got to sit down and really think about this to understand why your view of green development isn't in fact green for the region and for the country. I think there are people out there who aren't engaged in the housing debate, who are persuadable, who can learn that allowing more apartments is good for younger households, it's good for the economy, it's good for future workforce, it's good for climate. If we can tell them the story in a way that persuades them that it's actually in their best interests in the long run, I think there are more people who could get engaged in a useful way. Right, and I sort of joke that if we think about the audience as like the hardcore NIMBYs aren't going to read my book, and if they do, they're just going to get angry. For the YIMBYs, I do hope that this is a tool that they can use, right? So for elected officials or for voters to say, hey, this is language that explains why our current systems don't work, and these are some constructive solutions that we can use. And then I also hope that people who aren't engaged in housing now but are persuadable might read some of this and say, you know what, actually I should care. Maybe I should from time to time show up at a city council meeting and lend my voice on the yes side, right? So I think we have more potential allies than we have found so far, but you do amazing work reaching tons of people, and every time you write a report saying, housing is really screwed up and we should fix it, I'm like, yes, Jerusalem's bringing more people into the YIMBY tent. So I think the more journalists we have, the more research we have, and the more conversations people have with their own families, with their own neighbors, it's much easier to be persuaded by somebody personally who's making the case. And so people having conversations with their friends and neighbors, with their parents and grandparents and saying, look, I can't buy my first house because you guys won't let apartments be built next to you. Like, this is really about me too. Those are the conversations that I think have a chance to break through.
And one thing that I was so excited to see in your book, which is, now this is about solving Jerusalem's personal housing problems, so this is exciting, welcome, is rethinking homeownership at all. Like, I'm a renter, I'm sure there are a lot of people here who either have been renters or are renters now, and homeownership has been the singular way that people have conceived of from the federal government as building wealth for lower and middle class Americans. But intriguingly, higher income Americans diversify the way that they build their wealth. They do not just put all of their money into one single asset that's locked into one single place. They have 401ks and other ways that they have investments that are diversified. And so, rethinking homeownership, it feels like, putting aside the political third rail of this conversation we're about to have, but it does seem like there needs to be a better way to think of how to provide both stability to renting, safety to renting, and just a way for people to still long-term engage with having a steady financial future. So how can I have a steady financial future, Jenny?
I would love for us to use the federal tax code more strategically to encourage people to save money, not just through home ownership, but through other things, right? So like, we have tax preferred savings for home ownership and for your retirement plan. What about to put aside a pot of savings that you can tap into for short-term resources, right? We could create essentially something like a 401k that's just for like shorter term, like pre-retirement expenses, right? And make that tax preferred. I would love to see something like renters, when they sign a lease on an apartment, can set up a savings account, and every month when they pay their rent, they pay an extra $25 that goes into the savings account, and it accumulates, and then they move to another apartment, but the savings account goes with them, right? So we could do things like this, these little behavioral nudges that make it easier for people to be saving money as they are renters, whether they use that as a down payment for a home or to go to college or just to have for a rainy day. I don't really care. I want people to have liquid savings. So we could do this stuff. Part of the problem is, as long as we assume renting is what you do until you buy, right? The goal is to get people into homeownership as quickly as possible. We don't have an incentive to make renting a better experience. So that goes both for things like tenant protections, right? Making it a safe and stable place to be, and for ways that people can build wealth other than homeownership, right? So I think at some point we need to drop the sort of the rhetoric of everybody should become a homeowner as quickly as possible and say, you know what, people are going to rent, people are going to own, both of those things are fine. It should be okay for middle-class people to be renters their entire life, right? There are other countries where that's true, but in the US it's sort of assumed renting is what you do if you're young or you're poor, but it's not a desirable steady state. And I think every time a presidential candidate runs for office and says, homeownership is part of the American dream, I kind of cringe a little bit, right? Homeownership doesn't have to be the American dream. Renting should be the American dream too. I want people to have a decent place to live and financial stability. There's more than one way to get there.
And I think one thing that's interesting to me is just why there hasn't been a broader rethinking of this, because, you know, we had a great recession that was precipitated by a housing market crash, and I thought after that we would start considering if potentially it was not good to just incentivize every single person to buy a house regardless of their situation. But instead it seems like we've just doubled down. And do you have thoughts on why that is, or if you see an actual political coalition of renters building to change that?
So one of my favorite subheader recommendations in the final chapter is elect more renters. And I actually think that that is part of the problem, that our elected officials at every level of government are overwhelmingly homeowners. They tend to be older also, so it's been a while since they've been a renter. Other countries have more active renter parties where there's actually a political party organized for people who rent their homes, and they can do things like negotiate contracts with landlords overall. But just to have those interests represented in government, I think would help. I don't know if you guys remember in the New York mayor's race last year, I think it was the New York Times asked all of the candidates to guess what's the median price of a house in Brooklyn, and almost all of them were off. But they guessed 50% of what it actually was, and it was kind of embarrassing. Part of it is they all own homes, and they bought their homes 15 or 20 years ago. They have no idea what it costs to buy. They have no idea what it costs to rent, right? So all of the older homeowners who say you could buy your first house if you stopped eating avocado toast, they have no idea what people are paying in rent, right? So there's this disconnect between what homeowners think it costs to rent an apartment, what it actually costs. If we had more people who rented in elected office, I think that would help.
Or maybe we should just print everyone's imputed rent constantly so they have to know. Okay, we're going to turn to some audience questions. So first one is from Jonathan Dworkin at New Deal Leaders. How should state and local elected officials think about using funds from the American Rescue Plan on housing? Are there good examples you've seen so far?
So the American Rescue Plan has relatively big pots of money with a lot of flexibility for state and local governments. And obviously, I think they should spend most of this on housing, but they've got some other issues that they're working on too. There are a lot of opportunities, I think, to do both one-off investments. So I would love to see more local governments acquire existing housing. Your money goes farther than trying to do new construction. It comes online faster. You can potentially get apartments in places that won't allow you to build. And money from the American Rescue Plan could go into Affordable Housing Trust Fund, get you to acquire housing and make it part of the long-term affordable stock. I would love to see more places also do things like locally funded vouchers. If Congress isn't going to expand vouchers, local governments, especially in the wealthy places, could. And that's another way that quickly we could start helping households. And again, you can help more households with that than doing development, which is a big chunk of money. So I think there are lots of ways that it can be spent. I'm hoping that local governments are strategic about how they spend their money. We're probably not going to see another windfall like this very often. And so, really make the most out of this one.
And from HUD, Regina Gray, in your view, what is the biggest barrier to more equitable development?
I'm going to have to go with NIMBYs on that one. It's really about the politics, right? We're not going to get more housing built in the places it needs to get built as long as local residents have the ability to stop it. And as long as we continue to privilege long-term homeowners over younger households and renters and people who aren't yet in the community, we're not going to get equitable development.
And from Jeremy Castle, as a DC resident, what would you like the DC Council/Planning Office to take away from your book?
Upzone Northwest DC, and if you have to upzone the whole city to get there, that would be great too. But the DC, I think, is a great example where certainly the mayor's office, the Office of Planning, they know this. They know what they need to do. It's a question of moving voters along. Before we went into shutdown mode with the pandemic, the Office of Planning was doing a whole series of strategic meetings in different parts of the city, talking through the history of racial exclusion, the history of exclusionary zoning, why more housing was important for the district. So they were going through this kind of very careful kind of community building process around the need for more housing in the right places that sort of got interrupted, right? And I was curious to see where that was going to go. Elected officials have to bring voters along with them, and DC's in sort of a tough bind. We don't have a state that we can kick it up to, right? So like Montgomery County, in theory, could solve some of their problems if Annapolis stepped in. DC doesn't have that, and so it has to kind of figure out how to bring voters along by itself.
And from Jeremy Castle, as a DC I just read the same question. Okay. Policy change, as you've observed, is really hard. Is there anything going on in the private market, architects, developers, builders, that gives you some hope for addressing the affordability crisis?
So the private sector has a fair amount of experimentation in a couple of areas. I don't follow as closely kind of the construction and design side, but some of the promising innovations there are things like we could do a lot more factory-built housing, which gets housing built a whole lot faster. The US hasn't embraced that and scaled up. So Europe is much farther ahead than we are, right? You can build more units faster for lower cost if you're not doing every single one of them on site, and particularly in places where construction labor is either scarce or very expensive. Some of the new materials offer some promising innovations too. I think the problem here is that we haven't gotten it to scale, both because on the industry side there's been some reluctance. So building trades haven't necessarily embraced factory-built housing because it means fewer union construction jobs. And in places like California, that's a big political issue. It's also hard on the regulatory side. So some of the building codes, for instance, won't allow you to use some of the materials, or the building codes aren't predictable enough across jurisdictions that you can, like, if you could build fourplexes and just create the same fourplex and build it everywhere across every community, you would have somebody figure out how to do this stuff and churn them out. But as long as every single city has different building codes and zoning codes and different utility hookups for a fourplex, you can't scale this stuff up, right? So I think we need some more coordination between all of the sets of regulations, not just zoning, but the building codes as well, and industry to try to do some pilots and then figure out how you get from the experiments to scale.
And one thing on that I want to ask you about too is just you've seen during the past couple years, especially when it comes to supply chains, issues with actual construction materials to getting housing built. But it seems like longer term, just the cost of building a unit, even if there was not kind of some of the zoning costs that come along with it, is really high. Do you have a sense of why that is? Like, what's going on here? It seems like in other countries it's not as expensive to build units. Is this really just come down to regulation costs that are coming in, or is there other things going on?
So there definitely are people in the room who'd have better answers to that than I do on the construction side. So some of the materials stuff is global, right? So we have a global market for lumber, for steel. The things like building code regulations do affect which materials you use and how much of them you need. New construction is always going to be expensive. So, I think we shouldn't rely on new construction to meet the bottom end of the market. Traditionally where cheap housing comes from, it's existing housing that's old, right? That's maybe not in great shape. The ability to kind of retrofit existing buildings and make them, have a second useful life as housing as a possibility. Every country sort of has expensive new housing and then older, cheaper housing. We just don't have as much. And it's interesting, if you look at developing countries, they have a whole informal housing market that meets the needs of very poor households. The US kind of has that too, but it's illegal and we don't talk about it that much, right? So like if you go house hunting in Mount Pleasant, which we did many years ago, like there are a bunch of row houses with 4 bedrooms and there are 15 people living in it, right? That's our informal housing, right? It's illegal because they can't all have their names on the lease, but they're doing it because people need a place to live, right? So the informal side of housing is often the most dangerous. It's not particularly well regulated. It's not, doesn't meet fire code and the rest of that, but that's where people live because they got to live somewhere, right? If we could have a little bit more give on some of the regulations that maybe aren't health and safety related, we could do more things with our older existing housing.
Yeah, that reminds me, I went to school in Williamsburg, Virginia, and they have a law there that you're not allowed to have more than 3 people who aren't related living in the same house. And of course, you're a college student, you can't afford that. And so that meant you could never ask your landlord to do anything. There was one of my friends had a genuine wire, a giant wire hanging inside of her bathroom, and we were just like, this is life. This is it. Okay, back to this, not Jerusalem Hour. Okay, so Uva Brandes from Georgetown, what is the easiest path to zoning reform?
Sure. Send a copy of my book to every city council member and congressional representative in the country. There's not going to be an easy answer, and in part because it's very decentralized. There are 40,000 cities and counties that control housing supply. We're not going to get all of them to change their rules. In some sense, though, the problem is really concentrated in a handful of states. So if we could get good state-level reform in California, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, what am I forgetting? Probably Washington State. That's a pretty significant chunk of the national problem. So I really am encouraged that more states are starting to think about this, and some of the states that need it. But the state-level politics is not that easy either, right? Governor Kathy Hochul kind of put some zoning reform, very, very minor stuff on the table, and within a couple of weeks, Long Island homeowners had screamed and yelled, and it got yanked off, right? So it's going to take a while to build some support, but I think that's probably our safest bet.
And I know you're slightly joking about sending your book, but I have found that there are a lot of people who are actually just unaware of the scale of the problem, and that there's increasing knowledge has actually done a lot to change policy at the local level in less exclusionary areas. And from Salim Firth from GMU Mercatus, if a typical mid-sized city had $1 million to spend on housing shortage, what would be the best use of that money? It's not a lot of money.
How much?
$1 million.
Yeah, that's probably not going to go very far. So part of the hard thing about answering this in the abstract is I would give really different recommendations to, say, Berkeley and to Cleveland and to, a smaller town, to Williamsburg. So in a place like Cleveland, there's actually a lot of housing and a lot of vacant housing, but it's not in great shape. There probably are enough homes in decent condition that if you gave all the poor people in Cleveland a chunk of your $1 million, in fact, in Cleveland, you can probably buy a house for $50,000, right? So give every poor person a chunk of that $1 million and let them go buy a house. That's not going to be an answer in Berkeley. In Berkeley, we should take the $1 million and eminent domain and buy out the NIMBY homeowners, and then we can build apartments on their houses once they've been moved out.
The guy leading the charge is he lives half of the year in New Zealand. Annie Lowry at The Atlantic just reported this, and we could buy his house and end this. Okay, Solomon Green from Urban Institute. What are your thoughts on a role of that tenant protections, from rent stabilization to right to counsel and eviction protections, play in our tight housing market? Are they needed short-term solutions, or are they exacerbating the supply shortage?
Yeah, the tenant protections question is another tricky one across places because this really varies a lot across cities and across states. I will say that I've looked some at what other countries do, and there's a sweet spot, right? If you don't provide tenant protections, then especially vulnerable households are likely to get taken advantage of, right? So tenants who live in, crappy quality housing where there are real safety and health hazards, and their landlord won't fix it. That's clearly bad, and we should have a process where even tenants who maybe are in illegal or extra on the sublet, they should be able to tell their local government that there's a health and safety problem and have that enforced without worrying that they will be pushed out by the landlord, right? So there's some minimum level of protection that we are often not providing to vulnerable tenants. On the other hand, if we make it really hard for landlords to evict people, they will make it harder for those people to rent apartments in the beginning, right? And having lived in New York, you see this. New York landlords make people go through a personal interview and write essays and all sorts of things because they don't want to rent to anybody that they're not going to be able to kick out if they stop paying the rent, right? So there's definitely a balancing act to make sure there's enough tenant protection, but not so much that it discourages good faith landlords from being landlords or that it essentially screens out a lot of tenants that landlords don't want to rent rent to. I think in different parts of the US, we're at different parts of that spectrum. I actually think it's worth talking about a little bit more kind of federal role in tenant protections, at least for sort of a baseline minimum, right? So some states have essentially no tenant protections, and that we maybe shouldn't allow them to choose to do that. So I'm sort of curious whether something like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau could place some sort of a minimum floor for protections, or potentially serve to hear tenant complaints, particularly some of the landlords that cross over state lines. And I know this is an issue that comes up more with private equity purchasing a lot of buildings, that there's sort of this sense that bad actor landlords don't really have somebody who's looking over their shoulder.
And our last question is from Art Rogers. Case-Shiller and the other indexes measuring home prices start spiking after the 1998 Tax Act that exempted home sales from capital gains. This appears to have distorted how people view homes as an investment. Do you have an idea of what role the Act actually has in this problem?
I may punt a little bit on the tax stuff because that gets complicated in a hurry, but I think it's worth noting that if you sort of plot the amount of multifamily construction over time after the 1986 Tax Reform Act, it sort of fell off a cliff, right? So federal tax incentives actually do matter quite a lot. I don't know that we can sort of reverse those changes and get a boom in housing construction, but I do think it's worth thinking about what the financial incentives are for landlords who own properties and for developers who build properties. And if we can make it more attractive to construct, particularly rental housing, we should try doing that.
Well, Jenny and I could talk about this until we got evicted from the building, but we won't. We'll be here for another hour or so with freshmen, so bombard Jenny with questions. But it's been so lovely. This book is great. I read it so quickly over the weekend, and everyone should pick up a copy from Politics and Prose downstairs. But thank you so much, Jenny. Congratulations on your book.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.